The Major League Baseball playoffs roll on into the division series, unfortunately, without the Orioles. And the O's will have to wait until these playoffs end to start to do anything this offseason. But no more games left for Baltimore. So may as well do our first preview of this Orioles offseason. What decisions are looming? That's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, October 7th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to preview the Orioles offseason, give you your first look at what big decisions the O's will have to make when we get beyond the 2024 World Series and the moves can really start to be made. We'll talk about the group of Orioles impending free agents, how much they could cost, and which guys the Orioles could and should bring back in 2025 and beyond. We'll talk about players who have some club options on their deals, making it easier for the O's to bring them back. Will they say yes to all of them for next year? We'll talk arbitration eligible players, some guys who will be getting a raise. Now with David Rubenstein taking over, does that really matter? Will there be any non-tenders? And finally, we'll run through the 40-man roster, who could be added to protect them from the Rule 5 draft, and who could lose that 40-man spot throughout the offseason as the Orioles hopefully add to this team and make it better for 2025. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.com, Booking.yeah. The right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your baseball rivals. Book today on Booking.com, the official accommodation partner of Major League Baseball, and get the Booking.com app today. So it's an Orioles offseason preview. Now, the one thing to know is nothing can really happen in the offseason until 5 days after the end of the World Series. Now, World Series Game 7, if it goes there, is scheduled for November 2nd. So you add 5 days to that. That basically puts us here at the latest 1 month from today would kind of fully begin the offseason. So there is a little bit of time before a lot of these things can happen, before a lot of these decisions are made official. But it's still good to talk about them now because it's always good to get a head start. And unfortunately, there are no more Orioles games to talk about here in this postseason. And while the Orioles keep things pretty close to the vest in that front office, other teams make it more aware about what they're going to do with these options. Like, for example, I think the day after the Braves were eliminated, I saw immediately like, hey, they're planning to pick up Travis d'Arnaud's club option for next year. Like, they can't officially do it yet till the playoffs are over, but they're already indicating we're going to do these things. The Orioles and under Mike Elias haven't really operated like that, where they've let things out before decisions can be made official. So there's a little more time to speculate on some of these decisions. So let's start with free agency for the Orioles. We're not really going to get into, okay, which free agents exactly should they go after? We'll talk about that a little bit. It's going to be more about which free agents they would be losing this offseason, because the O's have 5 impending free agents on this team. Maybe a few more depending on some options. But we'll start with the big one, and that is Corbin Burns. Burns acquired by the Orioles last January in a trade with the Brewers, sending Joey Ortiz, DL Hall, and a draft pick to Milwaukee to get themselves an ace. The Orioles knew he had just 1 year left on his quote-unquote rookie contract until he became a free agent. The Orioles knew that Burns was a little upset with Milwaukee, the way they had treated him in arbitration and the fact that he felt like he wasn't getting an extension from the Brewers. And the Orioles knew that they would be making this trade with a good chance that he would only be in Baltimore in 2024. And with all of that, this was still a great deal. The Orioles got a legitimate ace. He made 32 starts. He threw 194 in a third innings at a 2.92 ERA. He will certainly be getting AL Cy Young votes and finish definitely top 10, maybe even top 5, which is exactly what the O's were looking for, especially after they lost Kyle Bradish, who was their top 5 Cy Young finisher last year. But here's the thing with Corbin Burns. Even with David Rubenstein now taking over, and the Orioles certainly going to be spending some more money, you would think, this offseason, Corbin Burns is going to be looking for a lot of money. Now, Spotrac, which is a great website that tracks everything free agency in all sports, including Major League Baseball, their market value estimation for Burns is something around a 6-year, $180 million contract. If that is actually what it takes to get Corbin Burns, David Rubenstein should write that check immediately, no questions asked. 6 years, $30 million a year for a guy that's been that good should be an easy decision. The thing with Burns is, it seems like he's going to want something closer to that Garrett Cole contract, which is 10 years, $300+ million. And I'm not sure even with Rubenstein, the Orioles are going to be willing to shell that out. I would think he's going to want at least a long-term deal worth $250 million. Are the O's willing to pay that? That is something we just don't know at this point, and something we will learn as this offseason goes on. But at the very least, if the Orioles do not bring Corbin Burns back, they will be offering him the qualifying offer. The qualifying offer you can give to a player one time. It is a 1-year deal, basically a set amount of money that you make for the next season. It's a little similar to the franchise tag in the NFL, if you're familiar with that. But with the qualifying offer for next year is a 1-year, $21.2 million deal. I think the Orioles would love to have Corbin Burns back for $21.2 million next year. It's absolutely not something he's going to accept because he's going to get a much bigger deal. But the qualifying offer allows for quote unquote lower market teams to get something back when they lose their big time free agents to quote unquote bigger market teams. So if the Orioles offer it to Burns, which they will, and he signs elsewhere, the O's will at least get a compensation draft pick in the 2025 draft, which is honestly a fairly high pick. It's not like it's down in the 10th round or anything. So you get a little something back. But either way, if you don't get Burns back and you don't make any other moves, this is the Orioles rotation heading into opening day 2025. Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Dean Kramer, Albert Suarez, Cade Povich. That is your 1 through 5. And your depth is Trevor Rogers, Chase McDermott, Brandon Young. That is what you're entering the season with. Now, that's at least a passable major league rotation, but you look at that and you're like, the Orioles absolutely would have to add at least one starting pitcher in the winter. They do not want to go into next year with those guys. And yeah, you might be getting Tyler Wells and Kyle Bradish back at some point next season from the Tommy John surgeries, but you cannot bank on that. So you would absolutely need to add 1, maybe 2 starting pitchers, free agents like Justin Verlander, Max Fried, Jack Flaherty, Luis Severino, Yusei Kikuchi, Walker Buehler, etc. You could try to trade for an arm again, like the Orioles did last year. Sonny Gray could be out there, Garrett Crochet, Jesus Luzardo, JP Sears, guys like that. But that's going to be a big decision. And I would think it's likely Burns is not back in Baltimore. So the big decision then becomes, how do you try and replace him for next year? Next big free agent for the O's is, of course, Anthony Santander. Big season this year, stayed healthy, 235, 308, 506, 44 home runs, was third best in baseball, 129 WRC plus for Santander. The best offensive season, best really overall season of his career comes in his walk year as he hits free agency, as it seems to do for many, many players. That market value at Spotrac has him at a 5-year, $90 million contract in free agency. I would definitely consider that if I'm the Orioles. You're looking at $18 million a year for a really productive hitter in Santander. Now, I know they'd be maybe scared away from giving a 30-year-old corner outfielder who doesn't move around the best a 5-year contract, but it's not a 7 or 8 or 9-year contract. If you're only paying $18 million a year, that feels like a pretty fair deal. Now, who knows what other teams would be willing to offer Santander. He's going to be that number 2 outfield option once, of course, Juan Soto goes off the board in free agency. And maybe a team that misses on Soto is going to be willing to overpay for Santander just to make sure they fill a hole on their roster. But the Orioles at the least will also give Santander that qualifying offer, you would think, at 1 year and $21.2 million. If they don't bring Santander back, which I think they should, and I think they should make all the efforts in the world, even if it is something around a 5-year deal. If it's cheap, like $90 million, go and do it. Now, if somebody's willing to give him 5 years, $150, maybe you back away a little bit. But Heston Kjerstad could certainly replace him as a power hitter in right field. But there's just no way you can expect anything close to Santander's production from Kjerstad in that first year if he takes over right field. And I think whether Santander is back or not, the Orioles are going to want to add a veteran right-handed hitting outfield bat in free agency this year. And if Santander walks, they're really going to want to do that. So there are some names out there, the Teoscar Hernandez, the Tommy Phams, the Mark Hannas, the Tyler O'Neills, guys like that could certainly help you if that decision is made to not bring back Santander. Then there are these smaller ones. The next one is James McCann, who came over in a trade and spent the last 2 years as Adley Rutschman's backup. Had a really good finish to the season. We know he didn't come up in the big spots in the postseason, but you could really argue maybe shouldn't have been in that Game 1 postseason lineup. Anyway, he played 66 games for the Orioles this year, 234, 279, 388. That's an 89 WRC plus for James McCann, who played good defense behind the plate for the O's. I think he's a great backup. And with the Adley struggles in the second half this year, the Orioles may want to give Adley even more rest next year. Not complete rest, but DH him more and catch him less. Samuel Basallo, while I love the bat, is absolutely not ready to catch at the major league level next year. He is not going to be an option for that true backup catcher spot. I would, if James McCann's willing to take a 1 year, $5-6 million deal, absolutely bring him back. Maybe someone would try to bring him in to give him a bigger role as a catcher, but he seems to like it in Baltimore. The guys seem to like him. I would be fine with bringing him back. But if the O's do want to bring in a catcher who's going to play a little bit more and they might ask to produce a little bit more at the plate, Danny Jansen, Kyle Higashioka, Elias Diaz, Carson Kelly, some of the guys out there they could go after. Austin Slater is also a free agent, came over to the Orioles in a very minor deal at the deadline and then played a solid role for the O's, 79 plate appearances over 33 games, also had a hit in the postseason. 246, 342, 333 with the O's. Just didn't hit for any power, but did have a 102 WRC plus. It was slightly above average hitter with Baltimore after really struggling with the Giants and the Reds to start the year. Slater could be a guy where if the Orioles are looking for that right-handed hitting veteran outfield option and those guys at near the top of the market that I mentioned get a little too much money, could easily see the Orioles bringing Slater back on like a cheap, 1 year, $4 or $5 million deal to fill that role again and see if he can do in a full season what he did with the Orioles for a couple of months. And, to have an above league average hitter who can play all three outfield positions, can run a little bit, veteran who's been on some good teams, that is really nice to have on your bench. And I could see the O's making that move. And then the final one is John Means. Now, John Means is most likely going to miss the entirety of the 2025 season. He made 4 starts for the O's this year, 2.61 ERA, and then had elbow issues again and got a second Tommy John surgery in basically just over 2 years. That does not spell good things for his career. And I'll tell you, it would be a big surprise if he pitched at all for anybody in 2025. I mean, maybe he tried to target some sort of September return, but it doesn't seem super likely for that recovery timeline. And with just everything he's been through, what I've heard between him and the Orioles, it's highly doubtful he is back in an Oriole uniform. I think someone will give him like a cheap 2-year deal where you barely pay him anything in the first year, but you allow him to recover. And then you're basically paying him to be on your team in 2026 when he is healthy. I would be willing to bet some money that deal comes from his hometown Kansas City Royals, who have a good amount of pitching, but would always be looking to add some more to be ready for that year after when some of their guys who have been good this year become free agents again. I love John Means. It sucks that he was never really able to be a big part on the field of this Orioles run the last 3 years. But man, has he meant a lot to Baltimore. And, if it does end up he's not back, I absolutely wish him well wherever he goes next. But those are the 5 free agents for the O's. But they could, at least themselves, create some more free agents because there are a good chunk of players with some team options on their contracts for next year and some players who are entering arbitration once again. We will run through those names coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Arena Club. For most of us that like collecting cards, the idea of spending $2,000 or more on like an Elly De La Cruz rookie card, that isn't in the cards. I like collecting, but that's some serious money to drop. Well, thanks to slab packs from arenaclub.com, now it's possible to score gem mints for a fraction of their retail price. Every card that was listed was hit from last week's Arena Club slab pack drop. Arena Club is the only repack that provides real value, a complete view of all possible cards, and clear hit rates for each one. Arena Club slab packs are revolutionizing the repack game with transparency. After your pools are revealed, they'll immediately be placed in your showrooms for safekeeping, selling, trading, or auction. And right now, you can get 10% off your first slab pack or card purchase by going to arenaclub.com/lockedonmlb and use code LOCKEDONMLB. That's arenaclub.com/lockedonmlb and use code LOCKEDONMLB for 10% off your first purchase. So as we march on with our Orioles offseason preview here in early October, we move it to the guys with club options. What's a club option? Well, it's something that is tacked on to the end of your contract, usually for 1 year, but potentially can be for multiple years, where once you get to that season, there will be a certain amount of money that is put down on the contract that says, hey, you have the option of extending this guy's contract for 1 extra year for this set amount of money, which was set all the way back when he signed that contract. Sometimes there are club options, which means the team makes the decision. Sometimes they are player options, which means the player himself gets to make the decision whether or not he's going to come back for an extra year for that amount of money. Sometimes they are mutual options, which means the team and the player has to agree to that number. Rarely does a mutual option ever actually get picked up because it's hard to get two sides to agree to exactly what a player is worth. But there are no mutual options on this Orioles team. And actually, there is nobody with a player option on this Orioles team. It is all guys with club options when we talk about options, and there are 5 of them. And the first one is Seranthony Dominguez. Orioles brought him over from the Phillies in that trade for Austin Hayes at the deadline this year, knowing that they could have him for not only 2024, but also 2025. It is an $8 million club option for Dominguez for next season. With the O's, he threw 22 2/3 innings to a 3.97 ERA. 28 Ks to 9 walks was great. The 6 home runs in about 23 innings is what got him in trouble when he did. But I would absolutely pick up that $8 million club option and bring Dominguez back for next year for that amount of money. He had success. The stuff is electric. He has a long track record of success in the Phillies bullpen in the postseason as well. He was good in his 2 playoff appearances despite the Orioles' losses. I think he'd be a great addition as a setup man before Felix Bautista coming back to that bullpen next year. Also in the bullpen, Danny Coulombe has pretty much the biggest no-brainer of these. He has a $4 million club option for next year. Coulombe struggled with his health this year, had bone chips, got elbow surgery, missed over half the season. But when he was pitching, 29 2/3 innings, a 2.12 ERA, 32 Ks to 5 walks. I think still before his injury, he was the best reliever in this Orioles bullpen. If he is healthy, or to be honest, even close to healthy, $4 million for next year for what Danny Coulombe has given you, that is an absolute no-brainer. The O's are going to pick that up, and he will be back. And then the last reliever on there is Cionel Perez. Now, Perez is in a little bit of a weird spot, so he is technically still in his arbitration years, but when the Orioles went to arbitration with Cionel Perez last offseason, they created a deal where they decided what he was going to make for 2024, and they put a club option on for 2025. Now, if the Orioles decline Perez's option, which is only for $2.2 million, very, very cheap for still a productive reliever in Perez, who threw 54 innings, 4.53 ERA, but a 3.3 FIP. Didn't strike out a lot of guys, walked too many guys, but, like a 58% ground ball rate. And he was big in big spots at times for the O's this year. If they decline that option for $2.2 million, he does not become a free agent, because technically he's not a free agent until after the 2026 season. So he's still got 2 more years in Baltimore. If they accept the club option, Perez makes $2.2 million next year. If the Orioles decline the option, he just goes back into the arbitration process, and through arbitration, they decide what that salary will be. The O's put that in his deal last year for a reason. They're going to pick it up, so they knew what they were going to pay him, and it's going to be $2.2 million for next year. Now, that doesn't mean they won't trade him. He is a candidate for that this offseason, but I think that deal will be picked up. Then among the hitters, there's 2 of them. First is Ryan O'Hearn. The Orioles worked in an $8 million club option for him for 2025. Played 142 games for the O's this year, about 500 plate appearances. Hit 264, 334 on base, 427 slugging, a 119 WRC plus for O'Hearn this season. Had his ups and downs, definitely struggled down the stretch along with the rest of the Orioles offense, but cut way down on the strikeouts. He became like a Luis Arraez with power. Now, not that good in terms of batting average, but continued to put the ball in play. Was really good with 2 strikes, avoided strikeouts for most of the season. And that's pretty cheap for a guy who can produce in the middle of your order, which is what O'Hearn has done basically for the last 2 years. If the O's think he can do anything close to continuing that, basically bring O'Hearn back on a 1-year, $8 million deal, is very, very cheap for a productive regular hitter, even a guy who does not start against lefties. I don't think it's as much of a no-brainer as Coulomb, but it's pretty close to that. I would absolutely pick up the $8 million on Ryan O'Hearn. And then the one I would decline is the final one. I think everybody knows who it is. It is Eloy Jimenez. The Orioles acquired him in a very minor deal at the deadline from the White Sox, was still hitting the ball really hard, was just super injured, was beating the ball into the ground. The Orioles hoped they could get him to lift the ball a little bit better, to at least be a productive DH against lefties, especially as the offense struggled. They weren't right-handed enough. They had some injuries. Just didn't really work out for Eloy. He was good in August, kind of fell apart in September. You could see the injuries. In 33 games, he made 100 plate appearances with the O's, hit .232, had just a 69 WRC plus, hit just one home run. Now, he still hit the ball hard, and the Orioles actually got him to up his launch angle by a good amount. So that was the goal, and they did that. He just didn't turn it into production, didn't play enough really to turn it into production. It is a $16.5 million club option for Eloy Jimenez for 2025. That was back when he signed an extension, when he was good with the White Sox, before all the injuries and before they collapsed. The Orioles are not picking up a $16.5 million option for Eloy Jimenez. He will become a free agent, but if he's willing to come back on a cheap one-year deal, maybe the O's see something there where they can continue to work with him, get him healthy, and he could be a productive right-handed DH type, but it would have to be a much smaller one-year deal after they declined that option. And then there are the arbitration eligible players. If you're unfamiliar with the process of arbitration, once you have played usually already 3 years in the big leagues, you're making mostly set smaller salaries. You then hit arbitration, which definitely bumps your salary up. So guys that are hitting arbitration for the first time this year would be like Adley Rutschman. He's going to make much more money for the first time in 2025. What that means is the player and the team come together and they basically look at the player's stats and they try to decide how much is this player worth money-wise to be paid for the next season based on this season's statistics. The team files a number. The player files a number. They have a chance to negotiate with each other to get that number to the middle. If they do agree, that's the number that the player makes the next year. If they don't agree, the teams and the player then go to arbitration. They each submit their final number. So say it's Adley Rutschman, the Orioles submit $5 million, Adley Rutschman submits $7 million. It goes to a neutral third party who hears arguments from both sides, and he can't come together and pick the middle. He can only pick either the team's $5 million or Adley's $7 million, and that is what the player, in this case, Rutschman, would make during the 2025 season. It's an odd process, but it does allow players to make a little bit more money as they get better before they do become free agents. So I'm going to put up on the screen here, if you are watching on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to put up here on the screen all of the Orioles arbitration eligible players for next year. This is courtesy of MLBTradeRumors.com, who does an amazing job of covering the arbitration process. Now, there is one player on here in Cionel Perez who I already talked about, because again, if the Orioles decline the club option, he then moves back into arbitration. But overall on this list, there are 15 Orioles. Once again, a large number of guys. And this is what happens when you have a very young team and you haven't spent a lot on free agents. A lot of your guys are going through arbitration at the same time. This is one of the biggest numbers in baseball, 15 players in arbitration. If you're watching on YouTube, you can read out all the projections. MLB Trade Rumors does a projection for what each player will most likely get in terms of what their salary will be for 2025. So what you can do in arbitration is you can opt in to the arbitration process and find that number for that guy, or you can non-tender a player. What that means is you just say whatever he's going to be worth in arbitration is not nearly worth it for us to pay him next year. So we're just going to cut him loose and make him a free agent. You can always then re-sign that player for a smaller amount of money. But most of the time, it's because it's a guy you don't feel is going to contribute to you next year, and you're not going to pay a guy that much money who's not going to contribute at all. What I will say is, if you take Cionel Perez out of the process, because we already talked about him, that brings us down to 14 ARB-eligible players. I do think there's really only one definite non-tender candidate. That would be Emmanuel Rivera, projected to make $1.4 million next year. I know he was really good down the stretch, but he was very much a fill-in. Now you get Ramon Arias and Jorge Mateo back healthy next year. Plus you have Jackson Holliday and you have Kobe Mayo in that infield mix. I don't think there's a great chance the O's would be paying Emmanuel Rivera $1.4 million to maybe not even make the team. They could try to bring him back on a cheaper deal, on a minor league deal, but I think he's probably a pretty easy non-tender candidate. The other guys on this list who could potentially be non-tendered, Matt Bowman would be due to make approximately $1.3 million for next year. If the O's see like no path for Bowman to make the team, they could do it. But for $1.3 million, I mean, it's much more open in the bullpen than it is in the infield. So it might just be worth it to pay him that to get him in spring training to see. He was pretty good down the stretch to see if he can make the Orioles bullpen next year. And then the other ones, I mean, you could make a case for Jorge Mateo coming off the injury, but he's only going to be due about $3.2 million for next year, and he still provides you value. I think the O's will still bring him into camp, but that is a possibility. Other than that, all these guys more than likely are at least going to be brought into camp. Now, who knows if they'll all make the team? Some of them could be traded in the offseason as well, but most of these guys have done enough for the Orioles where, you know, even Cedric Mullins for $8.7 million. Yeah, he'll be back. Gregory Soto for $5.6 million. He was good enough down the stretch. Yeah, he'll be back. Ryan Mountcastle for $6.6 million. Like, okay, you know, he hasn't been his best, and they could trade him, but he's going to be back for that. Adley Rutschman at only $5.8 million. Of course, that is, you know, easy to pay a catcher that good, even with his struggles. Even Trevor Rogers going to be due $2.8 million. The O's are still going to try to figure him out. They traded for him at the deadline. They're absolutely giving him that money to bring him back. Ramon Arias, $3.1 million. Like, he pulled it together at the end of the year and became a really important piece of this team. He could have been a non-tender candidate. Now he's like, yeah, he's going to be on this team next year. So those are the decisions. Again, I think Rivera would be the only real big one who it feels like, yeah, that's probably a non-tender candidate for the O's. But when you do non-tender someone, you also clear their spot off the 40-man roster. And that's the last thing I want to talk about before we go. What is that O's 40-man going to look like as we go through the offseason? That's coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. You can explore those U.S. cities you always secretly wanted to learn more about. With Booking.com's hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more, you might just find your perfect stay, even in your baseball rival city during the postseason. Now, the Orioles aren't alive anymore, but say you want to just go be a Royals fan for a bit. And not really a Royals fan, but an anti-Yankees fan. You could still book an amazing hotel at Booking.com in New York City. Head to the Bronx for the games, maybe game 2 here on Monday, and hopefully see the Royals even up that series. Either way, Booking.com delivers exactly the right U.S. stay for you. And the right stay, it can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your baseball rivals. And you can do it all and book it all at Booking.com. Booking.yeah. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And not much of an NFL slate left anymore, but you look at FanDuel now, there's college football now every day of the week. You got, I think it's the Sun Belt is playing games on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and Conference USA on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and you got Tuesday night action, and it's all coming up. You can get all those lines over at FanDuel. Again, that is FanDuel.com. So to finish things out on this Orioles offseason preview episode, wanted to take a look at what the 40-man roster is like heading into next season. And want to start with the Rule 5 draft. What is the Rule 5 draft? Well, players essentially who have been in the organization, in the minor leagues, for too long a time without ever being placed on the 40-man roster, then become eligible for the Rule 5 draft, where another team can go in and pick them out of a separate organization and put them on their own 40-man roster. And now those players have to stay on that team's active roster for the entire season or on the injured list to then stay with the new organization. But basically, it's a way for players who are not really advancing up the minor league ladder for whatever reason for too long to get a chance with another org, so they're not just blocked in by their drafted organization. For this year, most of the guys that are going to be available were high school picks in the 2020 draft and then college picks in the 2021 draft. The Orioles, I'm trying to think back, they didn't do much protecting at all in the Rule 5 draft. They also didn't make a selection in the Rule 5 draft last year. As you get better, the Rule 5 draft becomes kind of less and less part of your offseason plans, but it's still something that the Orioles are going to look at. And when you look at players who the Orioles could add to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft, really former Locked On Orioles podcast guest Brandon Young seems like the only lock. 3.44 ERA and 89 innings in AAA this year, was kind of on the doorstep potentially of a major league debut there in September. He will be competing for a major league, maybe rotation spot in spring training of next year. The Orioles are absolutely not going to take a chance to let him go away for nothing. Young's going to be protected on that 40-man. But the other names that are eligible, like T.T. Bowens, Hudson Haskin, Reed Trimble, Carlos Tavera, no, I mean, maybe I got like Justin Armbruster or Keegan Gillies could be potential arms. Maybe a Cade Stroud is a potential guy. But I would really only say that there is one lock, and that would be Brandon Young. And it's going to be pretty easy to open a spot for him because, first of all, the Orioles have only 39 players on their 40-man roster right now. Now, you do have to activate anybody who is on the 60-day injured list. You do have to activate that player back to the 40-man roster. So you're looking at Jorge Mateo, you're looking at Felix Bautista, Kyle Bradish, and Tyler Wells. All four of those guys will have to be reactivated to the 40-man. So that gives you 43 players on the 40-man roster. Now, on the flip side, you have 5 free agents who are going to leave that 40-man roster as well, at least for a certain amount of time. Corbin Burns, Anthony Santander, James McCann, Austin Slater, and we would think Eloy Jimenez. Now, John Means doesn't factor into this because he's on the 60-day IL, but he's also going to be a free agent, so he's never going to hop back onto the 40-man. But those 5 spots will open, which will get you down to 38 players. Then you can add Brandon Young as 39, and that gives you the room to bring back at least one of those guys. And definitely more, because the Orioles are going to be adding this offseason, and there are certainly other players on the 40-man who could easily have space cleared so that other guys can be added. Daniel Johnson, for example, played 1 game with the O's this year. He's more than likely going to be a DFA'd off the 40-man. I mentioned Emmanuel Rivera. He's a non-tender candidate. Once that would happen, he clears a spot on the 40-man. Birch Smith and Brooks Kriske are both on that 40-man. They could go pretty easily. Even a guy like Levon Soto, Brian Baker, I mentioned Matt Bowman, Colin Selby, all could be options to be DFA'd or non-tendered at some point and to clear space on this 40-man roster as well. Basically, there is a good amount of flexibility in kind of those final 10 spots on the 40-man when the O's do begin to upgrade this roster this offseason. And that is hopefully something they are planning on doing, not only bringing back some of their talent that's going to be free agents, but also going out and adding others to hopefully get another great regular season in 2025, and then hopefully a more successful playoff run next year. But that'll do it for today's episode. A lot of this roster stuff is a little convoluted. If you have questions about it, put it right here in the comment section of the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. I'll try to answer them either right there or on future episodes as well. We will continue 5 days a week, at least throughout the month of October, at least throughout the postseason. Coming up later this week, we're going to start reviewing the seasons of every single Orioles player on that 40-man roster. And I think the plan is, unless we get any Orioles news coming out tomorrow, I think the plan is to start with Colton Cowser. Seems to be in a good spot to potentially win AL Rookie of the Year, but it wasn't smooth sailing all season for Cowser, and his season actually did end with an injury. So we'll try to break down all of that on the Milkman on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.